Hello, I'm Chris Smith. I'm the senior editor of the Englewood Review of Books. I'm also the resource consultant for the Cultivating Communities project, which you can find online, cultivatingscommunities.com. I am talking here today with Mark Lau Branson. Mark is a senior professor of practical theology at Fuller Seminary in Southern California. And Mark has also written, and this is the reason that we're talking to him today, he's written one of the most significant books on using appreciative inquiry in the local church setting. That book is called Memories, Hopes, and Conversations. It's actually in its second edition now. We might hear a little bit more about that fairly new edition, which has come out within the last 5 years or so. But I think the original edition of that book came out probably about 10, 12 years ago. Maybe even a little bit more than that now. But it's a wonderful resource, and I'll talk with Mark a little bit about that today, and particularly talk about how appreciative inquiry might be a helpful sort of practice for congregations as they're trying to discern what does life together look like after the pandemic, or as they're coming out of the pandemic. We've heard that there's lots of churches, and even our own church, Englewood Christian Church, certainly has its own kind of challenges, figuring out the ways that we want to share life together after the pandemic, and certainly because of the ways that so many things were shut down during the pandemic, there's opportunities to do new things or to do things in different ways. So an appreciative inquiry can kind of help us make discernments that are really well rooted in who we have been as the past, and the wonderful work of God in the Spirit among us in previous years. So, Mark, super glad to be talking to you today. Tell us a little bit about, for folks that might not be familiar, just give us a couple of minute introduction to what appreciative inquiry is.
Well, good to be with you, Chris. Glad to do this. The theory actually came out of Case Western Reserve University when some professors, one of them Christian, were working at how does change happen in various management and leadership approaches in corporations. And it's quickly spread then to nonprofits and others. I first ran into friends in Thailand and the Philippines who are using it in just amazing community development or educational projects. I'd not heard of it in the US, but when I came back, I started pursuing and found at that point in the early 2000s, some pretty widespread and kind of inspiring uses. So appreciative inquiry is assuming that we shape our worlds by shaping our language. That language, on one hand, you can say is just descriptive, just use words to describe. But in fact, the ways we ask questions shapes the reality we're in. So I could ask the youth director of a church, how bad is it? And immediately your imagination goes to how bad it is. Or I can say, tell me the most exciting thing going on. And I get a different set of stories, right? And the minutes after that question have changed our brains. We see differently, we imagine differently, we think differently, we ask different questions. And so the questions we ask end up actually shaping our reality. It isn't that we use them to avoid, we don't use them to create barriers and blame, but they still provide access. My assumption in all the work I do in consulting and teaching theologically is that God is the primary initiator. That God is on the ground ahead of us with our neighbors, ahead of our churches, in the midst of members, but even those who are not believers. That the Spirit of God loves the world, and that's not a passive love, it's an active, ongoing love. And that means that as Christians, and especially those of us who are in leadership roles, then are working at helping a congregation discern what God's doing. So we're not out ahead of God. We're not creating structures that are more comfortable for God's work, but in fact, we're trying to figure out what God is doing. And so the better we get at asking questions that help everybody gain those capacities, gain those sensitivities, then the whole community becomes an interpretive community, interpreting what God's doing, interpreting what's going on the ground. And that helps us then enter into kind of an action reflection mode of life that helps us test that. It looks like God's doing this. Well, how do we find out? Well, let's try this conversation, or let's try this action. Then we bring that back and we think again and meditate and pray and use our normal discernment practices. So what appreciative inquiry does is it brings a unique focus to questions, the query. What questions are we asking of each other? What questions are we asking in the community that can elicit God's activity, God's blessings, God's engagement? And then that then helps shape another set of questions, somebody else to talk to, some other collaboration for some experiments. All of that then is sequenced as a result of learning to ask different questions.
That's great. I love your emphasis on the role of the Spirit in this. I think a lot of us, we're coming to realize here at Englewood the ways that we've been, I would say, to use theological language, pneumatologically impoverished. That we don't really, I mean, as folks that, I mean, our church is kind of evangelical or evangelical in heritage anyway. And a lot of mainline churches are kind of in the similar boat. A lot of Protestant churches, just in general, outside kind of the charismatic and Pentecostal sorts of traditions, just don't really know what to do with the Holy Spirit. And I appreciate the way that you're describing appreciative inquiry really draws that out. And because I think that's an important part, that we're not kind of building or doing something on our own, on our best days or during the best seasons of our lives, but rather we're trying to follow God in the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit? So you kind of given us a little bit of introduction to what AI is, and kind of a little bit of the kind of theological backdrop for that. But can you tell me maybe a story too about a congregation that you have worked with or familiar with, and how they used appreciative inquiry?
Yeah, and one advantage of the revised version of the book, the original book walked through mainly one church's story, and that was all I had. And at the time the publisher came to me and asked me for the book, I just said, I won't write a book. I've only got one story. And they said, we've got some other proposals for books. They don't have any stories. So we'd rather have your one story. Wow. And they knew me well enough to know, okay, that's the hook. Right. But in the second, there's 5 more stories. Mm-hmm. And so the value of those is just amazing. They're different settings, different cultures, different denominations, etc. I can remember one time in a church where there were questions around the youth work, and often the issue then is how do you get the appealing youth director who can play guitar and can keep the kids busy and out of trouble, and maybe becoming more like us. I mean, that's often the agenda. How do we get our kids to become more like us? And instead, we just knew we didn't know, right? So how do we start learning things? And one of the ways we wanted to do that was to create conversations. So we had the most senior members of the congregation, all in their 80s, if I remember right, sit down for lunch with the teenagers. And we'd always let at least 2 teenagers be together just for their own security and ability to banter and other things that can happen that are important for socialization. And over a lunch, they would ask each other, who are the most important adults in your life when you were a teenager, and why? So the teenagers would ask this of these 80-year-olds, right? Uh-huh. Now we know the value of story. Sure. We also know not every story is equally valuable, right? So what adults mattered to you? What did they do? Why were they important to you? And so the youth are hearing stories they would never hear in a normal church. They might hear these from their grandparents, but even that often gets lost. Sure. And then the old timers would ask the same question: who are the most important adults in your life, and why? And those stories started helping us understand how faith formation could work across generations. We also just learned how normal, everyday, emotional life, physical life, things happened. So that was just one of a number of questions. So again, the questions you ask really matter. Yeah. But it matters not only because of the content, but it matters because of the dynamics it creates in the relationships and in the imaginations of the people.
So that I love that example. Tell us a little bit more. How did, once these stories were had been elicited, were kind of out on the table, what did the congregation, how did the congregation kind of sort through them, and how did they discern a sort of direction out of these stories? I'm sure they were wonderful stories uh, of influence with their youth.
Yeah, part of it is in the appendix of the book, working with my wife, Nina Lau Branson, we work through the kind of schedules, either if you're sequencing a series of activities, AI activities over a period of weeks, or if you're focusing it on some retreats, half days or full day Saturdays or those kind of things. So there's all kind of models there of how do you sequence time, and even how do you weave in times of biblical lectio, prayer, the other important elements, other than just answering questions and summarizing, which it would be inadequate.
Sure.
So in that conversation, we did a little bit of gathering of the stories at the end of that luncheon. And we used, newsprint pads on tripods scattered around the room. We got quite a few people involved, actually, and just said, tell us a story you heard. And we'd usually throw two pairs together, and they would together tell one of the stories they heard that was exciting, compelling, interesting to them. And then the whole room would hear one of those four stories out of that group. And then we touched, do you hear any common themes? Do you hear anything that kind of ties these things together? And it wouldn't be unusual that those would relate to the lectio we had done earlier, some theme in a biblical passage we were working with. So another way that the Spirit engages the conversations. And so, for example, one of the things that came out of this was how some of the old timers talked about going fishing and fishing with their elders, right?
Yep.
And how fun that was. And so these teenagers, now we're in Southern California, we're where Disneyland and roller coasters are the big thing for youth trips.
Sure.
One of the things that came out of it was kids saying, would you take us fishing?
Oh, wow.
And I actually remember, it was nobody caught any fish, right? But we went up to the lakes that they were used to. We went up, we got a couple of, some of these old timers had some cabins. So we did that. And I actually remember a family of several kids visiting the week before we left. And one of the kids actually went up to the parents. They were from a church that did the roller park thing. And they said, we want to go to this church. And the parents said, why? Said, because the kids get to go fishing with the old people. Now, I can't imagine anybody marketing that, right? You can see on the webpage, kids get to go fishing with old people. This is how we build a youth program, but just phenomenal that just the sequence of what God was doing, not just for the kids, but for the old timers.
Sure.
In their life, in their faith development and all that.
Sure.
So you can't do strategic planning with this stuff. It's just a whole different route to listening to God and to trying to be perceptive to how God wants to shape the community.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment there. This sort of thing, or in that particular story anyway, it's not something that you could market. Tried to develop a program to do that apart from kind of the sort of storytelling work that you kind of described that preceded it. I would imagine in most church contexts anyway, that would just fall flat on its face. And maybe that's an understatement. It could be even more disastrous than that. But so tell us, a lot of congregations are kind of facing some tough challenges coming out of the pandemic. Things have been shut down or done so differently. And in a lot of congregational settings, there just hasn't been the sort of social, embodied, relational sorts of activities that would have gone on kind of prior to the pandemic. The sorts of, obviously kind of worship services, but also, things like fishing, just the ways that whatever churches do to build their relational capital and spend time with one another. So what are some of the possibilities, or what opportunities might you see for utilizing appreciative inquiry in this kind of season as churches are starting to come out of the pandemic? This kind of weird season where very little was what we anticipated and what we were familiar with.
This situation to a great extent is showing up much of the weakness of, in some ways, our ecclesiology, our missiology, but also our leadership, our understanding of leadership. So many churches are trying to figure out, if you are gathering centric before now, the longing is going to be to continue to be gathering centric. Mm-hmm. And that means all of a sudden you're anxious, can we get the people back in the room? And by and large, the data is not positive in that way, right?
Yeah.
And so you either get increasingly anxious to manipulate people and get into marketing or obligation or whatever your culture does to recreate what it was we thought that was important. And that was keep enough people showing up when we gather.
Right.
So part of there is the need on all of us to do some theological reflection about that ecclesiology. And so AI itself, if you're thinking about using AI to get the people back in the room, I'm the wrong person to talk to.
Yep.
But if the goal really is to ask questions about what's God up to, then I think AI can be helpful. Because so if the church previous to now had been, how do we live life in this place as part of God's life and mission? And of course, part of that is times together to worship. So, but it's not the center thing is this gathering, defining worship as a gathered people at a particular time. And then how do we live out there so this can be better, right? And that's often a people's understanding of mission. But I'm wanting to flip that. How do we live with God in the community, and how does worship connect with living with God in the community?
Right. So
part of it is your theology changes how you do AI, but now you know my biases on how to do what matters. And anybody who's read my other stuff knows this stuff.
Sure.
And so and it could be then that leaders have become increasingly aware that the gathering-centric approach was not as faithful as they want to be. So it could be some of the congregation or some of the leaders are aware it's time to, the disruption may have to do with a way God is disrupting that particular framework for us. So that's one of the things that's interesting to me in the book that I just did with Alan Roxburgh on Leadership, God's Agency and Disruptions. We're trying to work with that question is, does the disruption give God and us a better chance to get on into the same game? Right. So can we read the disruption? There's loads, the Bible is so full of disruptions, whether it's the exile or first century craziness in the Mediterranean, Titus's legions. So all these disruptions that are part of the stories seem to be places that God can actually be discerned and we can participate with God, right? Yeah. But it also means because disruptions create fears in us, fears mean we want to control and manipulate more. Fears and control tend to make us worse listeners and worse discerners. So how do leaders make us, what can leaders do to overcome fears and anxieties that create control mechanisms that lower our capacities for discernment? And I think any practices of listening can do this, and AI can do this. Part of what I would shift from what goes on in the book, even the book, for instance, asks questions like, in all your years at our church, when were you most engaged and inspired, right? Mm-hmm. And I think those are often clues to when God was really shaping us. The problem is a little bit then, and we deal with this in the book, that can simply be a matter of nostalgia, mm-hmm. right? Sure. And especially now we're in the danger of nostalgia. Because if we were gathering centric before, it was when this music was so good and so-and-so did the great solos and the pianist and the preaching. So it all becomes gathering centric nostalgia. I think we need to ask questions about, when have you seen God engaged at times of disruption? When have you seen the Spirit provide surprises during times of trauma? And to start asking the questions that get at our current time, which is a matter of disruption.
What are some examples that a congregation that might be disruptions in a congregation when a leader dies, for instance, maybe unexpectedly, or a church split, or I mean, are those types of, or other?
Yeah. And it may even have to be outside the church. So times in your own life, times in your community, times among your friends. Obvious, we happen to be in a community that has significant amount of the traumas of immigration. Mm-hmm. And certainly immigrant families have absolutely stunning stories of God.
Sure.
We do a lot of work. I do it through my school connections with homeless populations. And it's always surprising that the percentages confessing Jesus are far higher among the homeless population than they are in the general population. And they've got stories.
Sure.
So part of it is then those stories help us look differently, right? So rather than try to avoid trauma, let's just know it's here. We don't need to create any. There's plenty around. Right. So how does God work in trauma? So let's read some biblical stories on God and trauma. And that's one of the things that we do in this other book. And then do those give us different eyes to see what God's doing when the normal channels aren't functioning, whether it's the exile again or the first century. So can you figure out, where do you want these conversations and what kind of questions? And always test your questions a couple of times before you roll them out very far. And does this question get at, does it change people's sight? Does it make them look in different places for life? Does it make them look and perceive God differently than the habits we had developed pre-COVID? Now, there's certainly going to be things pre-COVID that are absolutely essential for us. Sure. And those are times of holy worship and times when discernment worked well. And that may not be a bad question either. It's when did you discern, when were you part of a group that discerned God was doing something that surprised you? It wasn't what you thought God was doing, but you actually learned to see God in a new way. Because those are the stories we need for this disrupted times.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Appreciate the emphasis that you've put on, I heard it just a minute ago when you were talking, but I also heard it earlier, just about the importance of kind of weaving scriptural stories in with the stories that we're hearing from the congregation, from our brothers and sisters in the congregation, and really trying to find the resonance between those stories and really discern not just kind of what is God trying to tell us through kind of our local stories, but also kind of how does that resonate with the witness of the scriptural stories. And I think it maybe this will be our last question here, but what I mean, it seems like it takes a particular type of leadership, particular type of facilitation to be able to identify the sorts of stories, scriptural stories that are relevant to the, I mean, like, for instance, kind of the example that you gave about kind of biblical stories of disruption, to be able to identify, identify the sorts of biblical stories that a congregation that would mix well and integrate well with the direction of congregational stories. Am I making sense? Or
yeah, no, that's a good question. And in the book, we make some suggestions and walk through some ways to process those, and describing Lectio and other things.
I'll encourage you to look at that.
And then in the book, Leadership, God's Agency and Disruptions, we spent a lot of time in Jeremiah, Matthew, Acts, and Ephesians. And so there's a total of about 16 passages that we work with that do look specifically at disruptions and how God walks through disruptions. And most of the time it's us getting disrupted, and it's often the Spirit really trying to take advantage of the disruptions in our lives. And it's simply the ways that disruption does give you a chance to either become defensive and controlling, or to become questioning and vulnerable, and even putting out your feelers in ways you wouldn't have otherwise, to other neighbors, to other connections, to other questions. And leaders need to be doing this so they've got their own stories. So we have our own stories, right? So we're not just telling everybody else should go do this, so we don't have to. So are you engaged in ways that are vulnerable and risky, and you have your stories to tell? But also leaders can model in front of a congregation in other ways, times of asking a question and actually noting you learned something. I didn't know that. I had never seen it that way. You're showing me something that connects me with something about God in this passage that I'd never noticed. And it's only as leaders that we show the capacity to be learning, to be risking, to be making mistakes, to be trying something else. And all of this is so different from, for instance, the Jeremiah 29 passage we often use about how in the midst of the disruption and the trauma, absolute awful trauma of the exile, of Jeremiah saying, God's not going to rescue us, just enter into life there, build houses, have gardens. Now, some churches turn that into best practices, which means it worked over there, it's going to work over here. We all ought to be building houses and building gardens. And so all of a sudden, all the churches are building gardens and building houses. That's not exactly what the passage is after, right? I'm all for doing that. So do it instead of not doing it. But it was to get them to settle in with neighbors long enough to learn something.
Sure.
And that's what we're not good at. But it's assuming you're going to be doing these things in the midst of conversations. And that's what lets you see what God's doing and alter our lives in that discernment to what God's doing.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thanks, Mark, for joining us and talking a little bit about AI. I might, if you're willing, I might ask to do another one of these in a few months about the new book and drill a little bit deeper into that. I appreciate the ways that you kind of hinted at some of the relevance that has to the situation that churches are in right now. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about
best wishes with all this. Yeah.
So thank you, Mark.